I'm recording, by the way. Awesome, guys. Well, wonderful. Glad you guys are here as well. And I'm excited about today. We have a great stuff. I won't necessarily come to a like a tight conclusion today, or like a things aren't necessarily going to be like wrapped up in a like a neat package with a final conclusion, so to speak. Maybe they will, but I'm talking about goals, your mind, foundationalism. And I have a number of things I want to share with you as I kind of fill in the picture here. So again, it may take some more webinars till everything kind of particularly ties together. Okay, let's take a look at slides here. So to this slide, the first slide here, is just we're kind of revisiting and rewording the kind of the original scheme, which I shared in the second webinar in the definitive series, right, where we talked about bottlenecks and then quarantining conclusions and foundationalism, right? So this is that same thing, but I'm just revisiting it here to set the stage for what we'll talk about today. So we want to focus on we want to focus strategically in life, right? It's not an option to when we want to accomplish anything, and really to accomplish anything that we do want to accomplish, it itself can be looked at and should be looked at as a particular bottleneck that you're trying to deal with. Remember, I use a bottleneck expansively. It could mean you need to get started, have enough, like overcome inertia, have enough momentum. It could mean that there's something that needs to be kind of opened up. It could mean that you need to realize you're on the wrong path. It could mean, you need to complete a project or finish some task or gain some resource that you need in order to as part of some other bottleneck that you're dealing with, right? And you can kind of go from bottleneck to bottleneck. And if you can't characterize a goal in terms of a bottleneck, then that's a good hint that you want to stop and think and about being strategic, because you have limited resources, right? That could be your mental focus. We'll give I'm going to give a bit of a scheme or distinction today that's actually not mine. And I'll show you where to read about it, but it'll fit in nicely with what we're talking about, and with what I am teaching you. You'll get much more out of it. It'll relate to this book by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, and I'll give the title and the author again. But anyway, we have limited resources in a number of ways in life. Whenever you have limited resources, then strategy is necessary, because you're going to need to allocate those resources to the place where there's the most relevant bottleneck, right? The most important or impactful place to kind of open up, or as I again use the word expansively, could be getting started, could be getting momentum, could be accomplishing a task, could be figuring out what you're not seeing. Alternatively, what people, and it's the wrong alternative, so the bad idea, but very normal, is that people, remember I talked about the cart, right? Like staring at the cart on a track, right? The kind of the mental image of a cart going on a track to a destination. And in order to have that happen, we just need to clear out all the potential bottlenecks, potential, actual, whatever bottlenecks, and then it'll get to its destination. It needs to, get started. It needs to have enough momentum to get over hills. It needs to not go on a false path, and so forth. If the track is too narrow, someplace for the cartwheels, then you need to, expand that, whatever. Instead, what people do is they focus, sticking with the mental image of the cart, on the cart, and is the cart, if the cart's going faster, and so forth, if it's getting closer to its destination, they'll feel like that is they're looking at the right place. That's exciting. There's the progress. That's where to stare at and look and cheer on and push the cart as fast and hard as you can. But all of that's is looking in the wrong place. Because if there's any type of bottleneck that you're not seeing, then no matter how close you are to your destination and or no matter how fast the cart's going or whatever, or appears to be going, you still might be fully stopped or not get to your destination. You're just kind of not looking in the right place. And as a matter of fact, it can be very counterproductive because you can imagine a meeting where people are excited about a project and they're all saying it's going to work and plan A is going to work great, right? For often when people do what they call planning and strategy, they'll have like a recipe of what's supposed to work, or it'll be like a checklist of how things are supposed to go, and that's plan A. And psychologically and actually, people like kind of need that recipe to work, and that's their plan. Their plan is for plan A to work, and they don't really have a. It's not even just about having a backup. Like it's not like the key is to have a second recipe. The key is to have a whole different way of understanding life, strategy, goal achievement, etc., thinking itself and so forth, thinking, planning, to where you, in essence, what you're going to have is a structure of plan A might be a sense of your best guess. And then you always have an understanding that you're checking, you're following plan A as part of gaining understanding of how gaining more footholds, more footholds is a good word. You're filling in more in understanding the complicated concept that our first impression of it. The idea of seeking understanding as progress, like seeing progress and feeling progress as seeking understanding, in and of itself, even with a kind of rudimentary and a kind of rudimentary understanding of understanding of what I mean by understanding, that'll still help you a lot. But then as we get a better understanding of understanding, then they'll kind of snowball. We'll be even better off and better off. So again, the right way to look at things is that you can have a plan A. You don't necessarily need to have a second list of what you're going to do if plan A doesn't work. But what you can have is a fundamental understanding of life and strategy and so forth, where plan A will, one way or the other, especially if you don't block this, if you kind of understand things this way, it'll, one way or the other, you'll have better understanding as you follow plan A. Questions will come up, and it's not as simple as you'll try plan A and you'll come to understand that it didn't work or that it did work. There's more than that. There'll be questions you can ask, there'll be distinctions you'll make, experiences you'll have, all sorts of things will add up. Like if you go to design a website using a website builder, and if you kind of hit snags and things where it's not really happening the way you want or not really working and you don't really feel like you understand what's going on very well, then by trying to do that, you're accumulating a bunch of distinctions. And when you read for instructions, or even if you read about a different website builder, you'll just have more background, right? And you'll have places where you got confused with the previous website builder. And that will, again, either help you ask additional questions to learn how to use that original website builder, or it'll help you have more distinctions, questions, and background and so forth when you're looking at a different website builder. Do you see what I mean? So it's not that plan A failed or not, it's that inevitably you gained understanding. And by realizing that and by having that be the real measure of progress, you will you'll kind of redefine positive thinking, which isn't just like, yeah, I can do it. All right, you can do it. This will work. This plan A will work. Plan A will work. Rah, rah, right? That type of positive thinking will help in the sense, like the kind of silly type that I kind of caricatured there. It'll help in the sense of if plan A would work, but you just needed to be a little more stubborn, right? A little bit more perseverance than that type of, yeah, it'll work, I'm going to stick it through. I'm going to make plan A work with my determination and my willpower. Sometimes that is the one bottleneck, is that you just needed to kind of push forward, right? But what will always work is this meta understanding of understanding as progress. All right, so and one further way to understand understanding is that you'll have a better idea of bottlenecks regarding the particular task or what you're doing, right? As you gain understanding, as you do whatever, then good. Okay. And to summarize, number one, besides the bottleneck part, my life got way better and way more effective by just having this idea, this paradigm shift of seeking understanding as progress, right? As opposed to, and then by having that, I start to notice what progress would otherwise feel like it would have to look like in terms of like getting kind of psychologically closer to my destination is progress. Okay, so number two is one where I particularly want to stress because it might be easy to sort of skip over in a sense. When I talked about quarantining conclusions, and then I've gone on and talked about how you're not your mind, and we're going to continue to explore that and see what we can do with that. Our mind is going to give us overconfidence in a big way, and it's almost like it has the idea that the confidence is like the most important, is way more important than correctness, right? Being confident is much more important than being correct. People will feel that emotionally, or and this will also manifest itself in that people will very commonly, in some place in their lives and in their belief system and so forth, it'll feel much more important to them, and based on their actions, they'll act like it's way more important for them to already be right than for them to figure out what's correct. And in those areas in life, they're blocked from gaining understanding, in essence. Or they're impeded. There might be places where they can still gain distinctions and experiences and stuff, but they'll be impeded. They'll be kind of locked into a box. They might be able to learn or discover things like inside the box that are locked in, but if the solution is, or the breakthrough they need is outside the box, then they're dead in the water. They can't do it. So again, if we picture a meeting of a few people and they're entrepreneurs, or they could just be even volunteering for their church and doing a project or whatever, right? But one way or the other, they're doing a project for work, for something like a hobby or whatever, a community thing, or for entrepreneurship. And you can imagine kind of someone that sounds like a naysayer about, hey, will this really work, or aren't we overlooking this? And it just sounds kind of negative to them, right? So what does that imply? Well, again, they want to feel like bottlenecks aren't really there, right? Or someone will have what they feel is a breakthrough. Like when I prepare for these webinars, this webinar series overall, when I work on law of implication overall, if you can get inside my experience, I'm really looking to get things right, not just to reach an emotionally satisfying bumper sticker, or just point that looks really good and it's very tight and just feels very nice and organized and all that. Our minds, again, we can see this through people's actions or through this mental image of people, talking about and being excited about a task that they're going to do. When I say a false breakthrough, it's like these false conclusions or conclusions that our mind gives us with way more confidence, with way more of a feeling of confidence than is warranted. And as we look into a certain kind of branch or sub-discipline in psychology, there's so much that some people have done in terms of experiments and theorizing and or hypothesizing and doing experiments and so forth, showing how pervasive it is that our minds are overconfident and value that kind of feeling of confidence and so forth. So our mind gives us conclusions. And it will make us feel like we have breakthroughs or that we don't need breakthroughs, right? Because we're confident everything's fine. And we need to not fall for that. And we need to, instead of taking pride in this feeling of confidence and not wanting to break that confidence by looking too closely, we want to have a paradigm shift that where we kind of get our feeling of confidence and just generally our strategy and our thinking revolves around not jumping to conclusions, right? And here we can have a mental image of a detective like Sherlock Holmes or something doing things right, where they are accumulating clues, they're asking questions, they're noticing anomalies, but they're not priding themselves on jumping to conclusions. And there's various scenes in various Sherlock Holmes books where the policeman, like Lestrade or somebody, jumps to a conclusion. They have a nice package, nicely kind of wrapped package in their mind of how the crime happened, and they feel good about that, and they don't want that broken, right? They don't want holes poked in it. It just feels nice and tight, and confidence goes along with it, and it feels good. Let me just go to the slide here. I wrote here, in addition to potentially helping you day by day, like everything we're talking about here, there's going to be extremely important inflection points in your life where you'll need to get this right. Like I talked last webinar about how our mind makes models of the world and of concepts, and everything is a model in the sense of everything's an analogy. We don't really see anything as it is unless we're stipulating, which I'll get to in the future. But outside of stipulating, we think in terms of models, but don't feel like we're thinking in terms of models. We feel like we're thinking about reality and seeing reality and feeling and experiencing reality and hearing reality, when in fact it's all a model, and that model overlaps with what's going to work plenty, right? Like if you're playing a video game and you're a guy running through the woods fighting goblins, then there's a model, like you are a guy with a sword, there really are goblins, they shoot arrows, you have a shield, right? Like that's a model. It doesn't exist anywhere. There's no actual shield, right? Except that the model overlaps with reality plenty, and it might overlap really perfectly in the sense that there's no practical difference between realizing it's a model but not real versus or not, like yeah, like kind of the meta idea, the meta realization that it's a model, that it's not real only matters, of course. I mean, people are aware it's, as you're doing it, you feel that it's like a model, right? Like I'm this guy, I have a shield, they're shooting arrows, right? The arrow hit my shield, the arrow hit me, it hurt me. That's all a model, right? There's not it overlaps with what works. It overlaps with reality in some sense. And that overlap is like fully effective within the context of playing the video game. So there's plenty of times when our kind of normal way of thinking will overlap with reality effectively enough, where we won't need meta understanding, meta strategy, law of implication, and so forth. And then there's times when you will need it, and they're not gonna, come labeled. And there's going to be inflection points in your life. This will help you day by day with your responses to people and just all kinds of ways. However, separately from whether or not you're noticing that or whether or not that's how often that happens or whatever, there's going to be major, and it won't even necessarily appear as a decision is the thing, right? There'll just be decisions that you rubber stamp or decisions you don't see, but there'll be inflection points where you could realize or choose something rather than another. It's going to make a huge difference. It could make literally millions of dollars of difference, right? There might be one thing outside your comfort zone that you need a certain way of getting outside your perspectives and your mind and norms and standards in order to realize to do. Or there might be something that's causing you to spend money that can literally cause you to spend all the money that you end up earning. You could miss out on a relationship, like a business relationship, love relationship, whatever, or et cetera, et cetera. You could just miss one thing that's really important to someone that would be that then would make possible a different level of relationship that could be very impactful for you in your life, right? So anyway, there are these inflection points that are going to really, really matter. And again, there's these kind of invisible boxes that you'll be in or that you are in, and you need this to break out of them, right? No one needs a success philosophy for something that they were going to basically accomplish anyway, right? With their current conceptual boxes, luck, talent, etc. But then there's things that are going to be outside of your reach. Could be breaking certain habits, right? There's a whole number of things that you're only going to be able to reach by breaking through a sort of invisible wall with what I'm showing you in this series. And there might be something that you want to accomplish, and you might be hoping to use what I'm talking about here for that. And everything, it will be applicable, but it might not, the solution might not just appear right away for you. It might take even years. So sometimes people can watch my webinars and think, all right, there's this one thing in my life I want to overcome or deal with. And it's perfectly healthy to do that. But just beware of needing to feel like you're moving psychologically closer to getting the result that you're looking for with your particular topic that you have in mind in each webinar, if that makes sense, right? Each webinar will be helping you accomplish anything that you would otherwise be blocked with, but you won't necessarily see yourself move closer to where you're trying to get to in each webinar. Maybe you will, but maybe you won't. Okay. Okay. And then as I continue here on number 2, valuing the struggle or the journey over the win. And I put this in here with number 2, with the conclusions and quarantining conclusions and the feeling like of false breakthroughs and such. When you're struggling, when you're saying something like, life's, it's about the journey, not the destination. Well, when you think in terms of bottlenecks, it is about breaking the bottleneck. It's not about like the journey of breaking the bottleneck, right? Like you want to break through. The only reason why you would value the struggle or the journey, certainly you can enjoy yourself at all times and you can find it all interesting and you're gaining understanding. But when you're trying to like kind of soothe yourself by reveling in the struggle or the journey or the challenge, that's really gonna be like a defense mechanism relating to, oh, you don't really need to have a breakthrough anyway. Do you see? Like you want to really value the breakthrough and the understanding that's going to lead to it, right? Like, but the thing is with understanding, when you don't need to struggle to gain understanding. When you're struggling, you're obviously taking your eye off the ball because because understanding constantly happens whatever you do if it's not blocked. If you have the right paradigm about understanding as progress, then you can't be stopped. You're always making positive progress. It's a very wonderful way to live your life. So you feel encouraged and confident consistently, right? And there isn't a struggle, right? There's just winning, because you win as you gain understanding, and then understanding will cause a breakthrough. But the progress isn't a matter of getting psychologically closer to your result, getting closer and closer and closer to your result, and then bang, you cross the finish line. It's more like you reach a critical mass. Sometimes you don't seem to be moving closer to your result in the normal way, but then bang, it just all fills itself in, appears. All of a sudden you can just reach out and grab it like it's nothing, etc. That's how the real process of achieving breakthroughs tends to look like. It won't always look exactly the same. Like, certainly there's plenty of times in life when you can, like, just, you want some coffee, you drive to Starbucks, right? Like, that isn't like, all of a sudden there's like this breakthrough when you weren't making progress, right? You get in your car, it's kind of step by step, and you just kind of go to your destination, you drive there, right? But on the other hand, we don't need to classify that as a bottleneck and a breakthrough, right? Really, there's no bottleneck. You just want something, you get it. There's no bottleneck, right? Everything was clear. When there's an actual bottleneck or where you don't know how to break it, right? Obviously, if there's a bottleneck and you know how to break it, then you're just in the zone. You just kind of doing it, and it hardly matters to characterize it as a bottleneck, right? You just can already accomplish it. You just do it, right? This is we're thinking in terms of strategy when we're needing to allocate resources, et cetera. Like, there's a bottleneck we're not really sure how to deal with, or a project we're not sure how to accomplish, that sort of thing, right? Anything you could just accomplish, no problem. You just go do it. Okay. And then 3. So I wrote like foundationalism, right, for number 3. So here I wrote, get all the way to a breakthrough. You want to value footholds, right? Any sort of gain in understanding is a foothold. Any sort of truth or fact, or as we look at the mind, and certain things will come to realize about how the mind works, like little bits and pieces. Those are all footholds, and coming to understand, hey, if I am not my mind, then now I want to kind of understand my mind in sort of a different way. Like, before, I already thought I understood it because I thought I was my mind. My mind thought it was me. I kind of feel like I know myself in some way. I'm right there looking, as my mind, experiencing being my mind. But you aren't. Your mind is external to you. It's fairly mysterious to start with, and it's misleading in the sense that you're constantly being given models and feeling certain that that's reality. So in that way, your mind is always deceiving you with a false sense of confidence, or equating models with reality. But your mind isn't like a person that's trying to deceive you. It's not like a deceptive thing or being. It does what it does greatly. And the whole system is designed perfectly for us to have free will in just the right way. But then we want to use that free will. And we do that, to this idea of bottlenecks and foundationalism and so forth. Especially foundationalism is really where our free will is going to be necessary and then radically useful instead of buying into this idea of, oh, no breakthrough is really necessary. Is there really such a thing as a breakthrough? Come on, it's about the struggle. We want to just feel like we're good enough, we're awesome, we're superior, so that we can win our struggles. Like, we struggle and win. That's how we show we're awesome, and that's why we need to believe we're awesome, is because life is constantly all these struggles, and we won't have the energy to struggle if we don't have confidence, right? This is the whole lie, right? This is the fundamental reality of people, like, universally, right? Is that intuitively, without expressing it in this way, life is a series of struggles. Happiness is a sense of the sense that you can overcome struggles because you're good enough, awesome enough. You deserve, or you deserve to have good stuff because you're morally good enough. You measure up to various standards that are in your mind invisibly. Right? This is profound, right? How it's a whole paradigm that sort of makes sense when you can step back and look at it. It makes sense why people would make the mistake, why it kind of feels like it makes sense, but then also it's utterly crazy. Right? We need to have this false confidence that we feel like is real confidence that we're always trying to feed because it's always starting to starve, right? Because it's not founded properly, it's not real. That we can struggle and win, so that we have the energy, that we don't just give up, and that we can face the next struggle and keep persevering through the struggle. You don't really need the same type of perseverance at all, right? Like, because there's not that friction. When you can inevitably and unstoppably make progress through gaining understanding, you can step out of that whole cycle I just showed, right? Because you no longer need to like face a struggle, because it isn't a struggle to gain understanding. Whatever the heck you do, whatever your plan A is, no matter how ill-conceived the recipe of what's supposed to work is, you're going to start gaining understanding, and asking better questions and having some background, and then having a modified next steps that you're going to do, and then that is going to continually feed your understanding. And you're going to start, as you value understanding, you'll value footholds. And again, footholds might be a vague word, but what I mean is, going back to the illustration of with your using a website builder, then just like logging into the website builder and seeing the user interface, and even if you feel confused by it, that's still a foothold. You've looked at the user interface. It gives you a sense of what you first see when you're looking at it. You poke around, right? There's only so many places to click, right? And you see certain menus and you look. And even if you can't find what you're looking for, if it doesn't make sense, when you learn to identify and value that you actually have gained footholds, you have gained understanding, then it's all a paradigm, right? It's all a way of understanding the world, and that's wonderful, because you can't be stopped. You're unstoppable with gaining understanding. Understanding is progress that will inevitably lead to you breaking a bottleneck that's possible to break, right? Unless something's just impossible. But if it's impossible, then it's not the place you're going to want to pour resources. And at some point, you'll gain enough understanding that you'll make a better guess about where to focus your resources. None of us are going to have bottlenecks that are just impossible in existence, right? You're going to be able to be happy and dissolve bad ideas and so forth. So that's why I talk about not struggling. Because again, if you're struggling, it's an immediate signal that you took your eye off the ball when it comes to seeking understanding. You can recognize that you have not broken the bottleneck and you don't know how to break the bottleneck, right? But then you refocus on what footholds you've gotten, or what you can do that'll potentially give you some sort of more experience, questions, distinctions, whatever, right? That'll give you footholds. And the simplest thing could be a foothold, like anything that's related, that it's not a conclusion, right? Like if you look at a user interface for a website builder, it's not like your foothold is that it is confusing. That's a conclusion. That's what you want to not, that's where you do want to quarantine, right? You want to not buy into it. And then, right, and so, but we need to get all the way to a breakthrough, and we do want to believe, and then you'll come to experience more and more, that breakthroughs are very possible and even inevitable, including the breakthrough might be that like some things might be impossible, but you can come to realize an alternative route or solution that bypasses that, which is the thing that's impossible. Certain career paths or superstardom in a particular area or whatever might not be within your reach. Realistically, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but then you can find an alternative route to what where the real bottleneck is. Not just something that you wanted to prove to yourself you could do, right? Again, that's all in that paradigm of proving that you're awesome. You need the belief that you're awesome and the feeling of confidence in order to keep struggling, because that's what people think they have to do. And then, glorifying it as a journey. Of course, we can look at gaining understanding as a journey, if that's what we mean by journey, that's fine. Okay, and finally, I said value even small breakthroughs, and footholds and foundations, and even small breakthroughs over results. I put results in quotes because results, but the results that you don't need to value, or you can be thankful for them, but not value them in the sense of. So okay, let me not interrupt myself here. So the results that you want to be wary of is this result of being feeling like you're psychologically closer to your goal. When I say psychologically closer, not every goal is like we are traveling an actual distance in real life, right? Like if you, with some goals, you might be traveling a certain distance, or if you're building a website, then you're building something and it's getting more built, or if you're building a house or whatever, it's getting more built. And so you can see it happening that way, like it's getting psychologically closer, right? If you're trying to get to a certain amount of money that you make per month or totally, then psychologically closer means you're accumulating more money. Do you see it? So it's like can be very similar to traveling along a distance and getting closer. You can celebrate and appreciate getting psychologically closer. It's like a fruit, right, from a tree or a plant. How do you get the fruit, right? You gain understanding about what to plant, what seed to plant in what climate, how much light it should have, how much water and such, right? And then so you need to plant the seed and maybe till the soil, plant the seed, nurture it a bit, and then it'll grow, and a year or whatever months or a year or 2 years later, there'll be fruit. So what I'm warning you against is feeling like there's no progress until the fruit is there, right? You can be thankful for the fruit and celebrate the fruit, but without celebrating it as the only type of progress, or really as anything related to progress. It's more like the reward rather than progress, or just a good feeling if it feels like you're getting closer. It might be that you are getting closer and it's going to turn out that you're going to crash, or the house is not going to get completed, right? You can be halfway done building a house, and then for some reason it never gets completed. And so you weren't actually halfway there because you were never going to get there, right? So recognizing that just getting closer doesn't mean that you're actually that much closer necessarily. But again, I don't mean that you don't need to get a good feeling from it, but just be wary of being trapped or misled by that. And then what people will want is psychological progress, a feeling of psychological getting closer to the goal. And so they'll look for places to see it, right? So let's say someone's dating and they start interpreting everything that a girl does, right? Every waitress, right, is like, ooh, I think she likes me, right? So they start seeing, so to speak, or projecting psychological closeness just to see it, right? Just to kind of feel progress. All that should be a red flag for you. You want to reorient yourself to gaining understanding as progress. You can be thankful for results, but you don't want them to, anything that takes your eye off the ball with understanding this progress is going to probably be detrimental, sometimes extremely detrimental. Great, okay, so I've explained this first slide. All right, I want to get to norms and standards, and we want to kind of understand them because they're so powerful in terms of where our feeling of goals come from, as opposed to thinking accurately and strategically and coming up with uh, an understanding of where, or at least our best guess of where the most impactful next bottleneck is in our lives or in a particular project or whatever. Instead of that, people's goals come from standards and norms in their mind. And we want to gain understanding of this until we break through and out of, of this. And now, if you want to feel awesome about yourself, it's going to be pretty easy to come up with places and topics in life where you broke outside of other people's standards and norms, and you can feel proud of yourself for that, and that's great. But we all have that. But then there's standards and norms that we don't notice we have that are gonna that we're not kind of we don't realize they're there. We don't realize how much we're getting goals and feelings from them, and how much they're constraining us, and so forth. And the point here isn't necessarily to ditch norms and standards. That's not it. The point is to be able to be, as you're thinking, as and when you can't spend all day every day or even close to it, like thinking accurately on purpose, consciously, and so forth. It's going to be a fairly short amount of time or small amount of time relative to your whole day. But when you are doing that, you need to not be boxed in by norms and standards. And you absolutely will be if you don't break free of, um, you need to be able to break outside of norms and standards when necessary. It's not that you get rid of them all or you're always outside of them. It's right. It's like any kind of box. It's not like you need to just like be outside of every box, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's kind of not possible. But you also need to not be constrained by conceptual boxes that are relevant for something you are thinking about, right? Not constrained, right? You instead would ideally want to see um, frames and conceptual boxes and then be able to think inside and outside of them and so forth. Okay. So let me show you this in the next slide. So this is different than my vector thing. This might look a little similar to that in a previous webinar in a previous series or a couple previous. I've referred to it multiple times in the past outside of this series, but that's not this. I just want to point out to something that your mind can easily and instantly, if you had to draw a line that was about the average length of all these lines, that would be an easy task for you. And that's not a trick. It's correct to say that it would be an easy task. There's no illusions or visual illusions here. It's just your mind is good at that. On the other hand, if you were to like the idea of these lines end to end, how long that line would be, like adding them up, that you'd have to stop and consciously on purpose do the math, count it out, and that you have to stop and put effort in and think about. Your mind does not just do that kind of automatically and easily. Right? Do you notice that? And extrapolations like that, or adding up or multiplying of numbers can be fooled. Like if you show somebody like I don't have this on the screen, but if you showed them uh, 2 times 3 times 4, like if it was written down, 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6, all the way to 9, and you have people estimate what that might be, like the product of all those numbers, then they're gonna pick a smaller number than if you take another group of people and you say 9 times 8 times 7 times 6, all the way to 2, right? The same exact product, but starting with 9 times 8, they'll estimate a larger number, right? Because our mind, it's not good, it has heuristics, ways of kind of shortcutting the estimation or whatever of those things, that it doesn't work all that well. So, but it taking averages, norms, right, of what's out there, our mind is excellent at that. And so this gives us a clue into one of the major things that our mind is constantly doing for us, and it's good at it. And so it's kind of what it's basing a lot of stuff on. So, and this relates to your norms and standards that are in your mind. So a norm, even like there might be words that I could say or images that I could paint images of that are graphic in nature. They're violent or sexual or whatever that would feel like off, right? If I were to do them, just as an example, or if anyone were to do or talk about them or say them. So that's just an example of how we just kind of intuitively feel, right? That, or if someone is watching a webinar and at the end they're like, okay, well, that was a good webinar, or that was a bad webinar, or that was whatever, then how could someone judge that except if there was some standard in their mind that they were comparing? Somehow the mind was comparing something about its sort of composite memory of the webinar, however that got formed, with some standard that's also formed. But our mind can do that, right? Like we'll feel that. Or a snap judgment of someone's attractive or unattractive, or that person feels like they're nice or competent, right? So these are standards and norms in our mind. There's something that our mind is comparing with, and instantaneously we can feel like, oh, I like this person, or this person's confident, or this person's even competent. In one fascinating study, people were shown actual candidates of various political races, local or whatever, local, national, both, and just from one photograph, they would rate how, I guess it'd have to be like whether the person appeared confident or competent, and that predicted it had a 70% of the races like kind of matched with just the appearance of competence in whatever it is that we look for, a square jaw or a certain countenance, right, or whatever it might be. So again, there are all these invisible norms and standards, and so our mind averages and compares with averages and with thresholds, right, and so forth. And it comes up with these things. Where like it's pretty amazing to think that our mind, after watching a video or a webinar or whatever sort, is like, oh, I liked that, or I didn't like it. Right, interesting. I mean, it means our mind came up with a standard and compared, kind of all behind the scenes, and gave us a judgment that felt like absolutely correct. Like that's a good, right? That's a good webinar. Yeah, you could still say that I have good webinars and so forth. Don't get me wrong. Sorry, I have a random thing. I'm just kind of curious about something. 1 second. I'm going to pause my screen sharing just for a second. Okay. Oops. Well, this is strange. Paused. Okay, I don't know if I even paused it properly or not before. Okay, so that was just a little thing that my battery was not. Okay, great. The connector was kind of loose there. That's good. We don't want my computer to shut off in the middle of this webinar. Great. Okay. Give us a little mental break there for a second. All right, so let's continue here. All right, so I wrote a lot on this slide, so I have to read it to you. What I'm trying to lead you to is to see something that hopefully you'll then be able to unsee. I want you to be able to see, feel outside of norms and standards. You can and will sometimes need to base your best guess for what actions you will take on norms and standards. You'll also need to take norms and standards into account for the sake of others. And then I say, but you won't be bound to them conceptually. This is basically what I talked about, right? Already, right before I showed you, or as I was showing you the slide above. So I kind of covered, I paraphrased this already. But you won't be bound to them conceptually. They won't pull on or override truth. We'll also be able to spot this in others when we'll just think, geez, can I just explain this to someone and show them how to know that a certain thing is true? It's why I talk about like Hiroshima, and Nagasaki and stuff sometimes, or my example with Abraham Lincoln. It's so overwhelmingly normal to believe like Abraham Lincoln wasn't a monster, right? That's like way outside of our norms and our standard for like what a monster is, right? Of a person, like a monstrous person. Abraham Lincoln just feels way outside of that. But yet, it's not like it's common knowledge, but it's the kind of fact that isn't that hard for it to occur to somebody. Wait, maybe there was a draft in the Civil War. I looked it up, and Lincoln enslaved boys in the North. They could either pay $300 in those dollars at the time, or be conscripted if they couldn't pay it. And so he literally enslaved boys and sent them used them as literal cannon fodder, right? Literally. I mean, actually, they had to run in front of cannons with like bayonets and get slaughtered. They had to walk in horrible conditions. I mean, just beyond horrible if you just stop and think about that actually happening to somebody, or to your child or something. I can't imagine someone taking my son and kidnapping and enslaving them and then forcing them to be killed, walk without like good shoes or any shoes, hundreds of miles, just et cetera, et cetera. It's just and basically to invade, or literally to invade another region or place, right? And so that if we step outside of the overwhelming normalness of Abraham Lincoln being supposedly one of the best presidents, was the founder of the Republican Party, and I most certainly, because of the main way to look at this is motivations and vectors, so the constituents and what they want of the Republican Party, I definitely vote that way. But I don't identify as a Republican or anything like that for a whole number of reasons. But one of them is the founder of the Republican Party was, if we step outside of norms and standards and then just think separately, but then think of what a standard would normally be for someone who's an utter monster, and Abraham Lincoln completely fits that. I can't think of any human being on the planet in history more evil than Abraham Lincoln. There's plenty that are equally evil that did horrendous things, right? You get all kinds of beyond horrible tyrants and dictators and basically leaders of various invading hordes, right? Or revolutions or whatever the heck. But how do you get more evil than enslaving tens of thousands of boys and sending them to be killed to their deaths, right? I mean, it's just unthinkably horrendous. And not just those boys enslaved, that's beyond horrible, but then invading another region. Was it great that he freed the slaves? Of course, the other slaves, right? But he freed his enemies' slaves, right? That doesn't again, it stands on its own. What he did that was monstrous and beyond horrendous, and no amount of good deeds or whatever, right? And it's not like that morally. I don't feel like standing and applauding when someone frees the slaves of their enemies, right? Okay, big deal. It was a huge deal for the actual slaves, and I'm incredibly happy that happened. Of course, I am very, very much against slavery, which is why I have such a problem with Lincoln. But anyway, it's just it's not about him at all. I'm not on some kind of crusade against Abraham Lincoln. It's just that it's so shocking, right? It's such a great illustration, in my opinion, of norms and standards versus truth, and how I just basically haven't met somebody that realized that about Lincoln. It shows how powerful that is, right? Um, I talk about like the deification of the Apostle Paul in Christianity, um, where I don't get it. Christians will say like, "Oh, this is I'm a Christian, right?" But this is let's see what God says about this, and they'll just turn to letters that Apostle Paul wrote, like decades after Jesus, and Jesus never mentioned Paul, and Paul has no connection to Jesus basically for the Jesus end. Um, and with Jesus, there was a massive amount of prophecy over hundreds of years that was fulfilled in Jesus. So there's something went on there, big time. But with Paul, there was none of that, zero. It just doesn't fit. It's totally incongruous. If Christians were like, oh, I think it's interesting to see what Paul wrote. I mean, he was, a major figure early on, and um, excuse me, and so on and so forth. But this idea that Paul was basically the same as God when Paul wrote letters, right? It's like an algebraic equation, right? Substituting, like like let's see what God wrote or God says, and then Paul is substituted in, or Paul wrote. Anyway, you get it if you think about it. Why is it so universal? Even after I pointed out to people in many cases, and I mean like in my personal life, you guys, I could point things out to, and you tend to get it, right? That's why you're listening to these webinars and so forth. But yeah, it's crazy. And then with the nuclear bombs, where there was intentional killing, burning alive of thousands and thousands of children and adults. I mean, you don't burn random adults alive either, of course. But feels fine, right, to people and to myself. Like I experienced it when I was younger, like thinking like, oh, that's basically cool. Like look how powerful the U.S. is, and look how it's apparently saved lives of invading or American lives and this and that. Uh, as if it's anything but beyond unspeakably evil and horrible to intentionally burn thousands of, or one or thousands of children alive. And it was done multiple times. And then it was done in Waco, Texas. And then it was done just a couple months ago, right? But I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago in Afghanistan, where they're intentionally, they through intentional neglect, through utter negligence, they just Hellfire missiled a car with water bottles, right, and many children, and like 3 adults and like something like 7 children or something. So that's not cool, right? That's radically evil, and any group that we want to anthropomorphize and say this group any group that does that or approves that is not a group that I would approve of or want to be part of or identify with. So those are just some examples of seeing how when I see it in others, I know it's going to be in my mind too, right? And not those examples once I get them, but there are these things that just feel normal. And here's the point: is the same exact person who thinks Hiroshima is fine without really thinking about it much or whatever, or even after thinking about it, would say, yeah, I don't think that, like if you said, like, should we maybe just set several thousand children on fire? They would say, no, that would be extremely evil, right? And then the exact same thing is done in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And any attempts to say that it's different are just BS. They're just false. It's like, oh, well, they were Japanese and the Japanese attacked us. Or well, who's us? Who's the Japanese? Did the little children attack us? Did they attack Pearl Harbor? It's okay to burn those kids because some other kids that have nothing to do with them except in our minds, not kids, some other people, that like whatever, right? Like there's no connection in terms of anything that makes it okay then to burn thousands of children. But the normality of it, right? That it's completely blinding to people. Like it's a full blind. And it's, again, the examples are just examples. You can come up with all sorts of examples that are more close to home, more close to day-to-day practical life, to making money, whatever. Here's a very practical one: is two people in a love relationship. Because of it's so normal, there's a feeling that we need to have justice, right? Which is basically revenge, right? But a feeling of justice. So we need to get back the other person. We need to, they need to feel how they wronged us, or if they wrong us, then we're kind of a weak person if we don't kind of help them see, how they made us feel, if by, basically causing them pain one way or the other. So the seeking of justice, and it can feel like normal, right? Or if someone violated our standards, but maybe they didn't know that standard. Maybe that standard isn't automatically true. It's just something we feel, and we're like, oh, well, everyone feels that. That's just real, right? But it's just a model. It's just something our mind averaged out or came up with. But just these kind of, I don't know, socio-political examples, kind of, it's a place to kind of easily see how strong and pervasive these feelings of norms and standards come in, and how blinding they are. We can go on with thousands and thousands of examples. You can look for them yourself. Something I've mentioned in past series, I think the biggest predictor of a person's income, right, is just the socioeconomic level of people that they grew up with, right, in their neighborhood. That kind of sets their norms and standards for how much money you're supposed to make. And in terms of religion, nearly everyone in history and in the world now is the religion of their parents, right? And the main exception to that is if they go to college in America or something, and then they become the religion of the professors, right? This sort of secular leftism or whatever. But it's incredible how common it is for people to be the religion of their parents and their region and so forth and their culture. And how is that possible? They believe it's true, but you think that people would be like, wait a second, how can it both be true and everyone, is the same, like, based on what their parents were? One's, pretty obviously the cause rather than the truth of it. If something's true, just as anything, it might be that your parents happen to have something basically true, right? I'm a Christian like my parents, but I have certain differing viewpoints, like I talk about with worship. I don't worship Paul as God like most every Christian does, or at least most every Protestant or whatever. And I think it's pretty pervasive in Orthodox and Catholicism as well. And then I wrote here, along the same lines, you want to be able to see, in quotes, outside of shoulds and perspectives. I'm just basically saying more of the same, but kind of pointing out, like, it might occur to, like, well, things should be this way, or I was counting on this to happen, or this should have happened, or this should be this way. It's not that every time you use the word should, you're wrong or your mind is wrong. It's just that it's a red flag that am I substituting norms and standards for accurate thinking? All right. I read that. Okay. Let me introduce you, and then probably spend more time with it next webinar. I said your automatic mind, oh yeah, like I showed on that slide with the lines. Your automatic mind is great at forming and comparing with norms and standards, right? It goes out, it looks at your peers. It might look at authority figures for standards. It might look at a composite, again, of like what people make around you, or who your parents respect and feel like is, right? You get a sense of status from norms and standards. right? And a certain threshold or standard of how high status you need to be, and or you can't go below. I mean, I felt this when I was out of college, right? And I went to University of Virginia, and I truly believed I was better than other people in that way. Like it's not like I would exactly affirm that statement if it was written, but there were jobs that I felt like were absolutely beneath me. And you're told over and over again that you're better than other people when you go to a whatever school, probably any school. You know, UVA is like a top 20 school. So it might be hard to believe, like and it sounds silly for me to say it, but it's like you really feel it, like you feel like you've got to be better. You can imagine it by people that are like fashion snobs, or some people that genuinely feel like they're better than other people because they know how to, in their mind, dress better. They dress more in their mind fashionably, and they feel superior to people that don't dress that way. Or people might have certain knowledge of a topic, and they feel superior to people that don't have the same knowledge of that topic. Or prowess at sports, or just knowledge of sports, right? Or whatever it might be. Or of course, with in the entrepreneurial world, you know, it's mostly the money that someone's making per month, or total, or whatever. And there's a sense of status, and where you're basically better, and to be respected if you're above a certain number. And there's a number that if you feel like you're below it, then you feel like it's really beneath where you should be. And instead, we want to use some sort of accurate thinking and figure out, well, what's the bottleneck that I'm dealing with in life, the money is trying to solve, right? What's the greater bottleneck? And then getting money accurately guessed, you know, from that sense, from dealing with a greater bottleneck, right? That's how we should think about anything, and go from there rather than these kind of norms and standards. Because obviously they can either hold you back, you can feel guilt or shame, you can not get started with certain things, you can not do certain tasks, you might be willing to do certain types of sales or whatever, unwilling. There are just various things you might feel like are below you. A lot of people in entrepreneurial world will feel a sense of awesomeness if they have employees. An employee might be awesome to have, it might be a great decision, but you want to have that employee, right, as part of strategic thinking, accurate thinking based on bottlenecks and allocation of resources, and thinking through the cost, the potential costs and benefits. You might not, before you've had an employee and then you're thinking whether to get one, you might not have much experience, so then you go get one, and then you'll gain understanding one way or the other, right? Distinctions and experiences and so forth. Doesn't mean you have to get it right. It doesn't mean you will get it right just because you think it through, but you will get it right because, like I said, whatever you do is going to gain understanding, right? If you're looking at it that way. And what I mean is whatever you'll get it right in the sense that whether or not you might look back and think, oh, I should have had more employees or less employees, one way or the other, you did it right but if you're gaining understanding from it, and you will if you have that, like if you have the paradigm of gaining understanding, you'll always gain understanding. And if you're gaining understanding, you're doing things right. It doesn't mean you'll know a particular answer, like what's the exact ideal number of employees or whatever. But more understanding you'll obviously you'll narrow down your guesses in a better place. So the sentence I wrote here on this slide is basically just saying what I said when I had this slide up, where I wrote, your automatic mind is great at forming and comparing with norms and standards. It is far less great at adding things up and thinking things through. All right, so I'll introduce you. So let me just get my notebook. I should have had it here. 1 second, I'm just gonna turn off my camera for a split second. Let's see here. Okay, took a quick drink too. And we are back. Okay. And I will look here. Okay. So Daniel Kahneman, he the book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's sort of his magnum opus. He's pretty old now. He won a Nobel Prize in actually economics, but he's a psychologist along with Amos Tversky. And then so Amos Tversky, if I believe I had the name correct, and there's Daniel Kahneman, and together they started in the 70s. And it's, in my opinion, one of the major new and exciting new-ish, a new one he was starting in the 70s, sub-disciplines of psychology that's fascinating and useful. Especially it's useful in conjunction with law of implication. Without law of implication, it's like interesting and it's not going to probably do all that much for you. And I'm not denigrating it in the least when I say that. It's just kind of like calling a spade a spade. But it's brilliant. It's awesome. There'll be uses for it. It's a great book to read regardless of law of implication. And his I can only praise him, basically. He doesn't walk on water. I mean, he has things wrong. I think he's clearly an evolutionist and so forth, which is ridiculous. But anyway, he has this model that can be very helpful for us to. It's not that we take it as the only model, but as a very useful distinction. And then his research based that kind of uses these models. It can be anyway. So he talks in terms of system 1 and system 2, which are aspects of your brain, your mind. All right. System 1 is basically your automatic mind, and system 2 is that he called it thinking fast and slow. And the fast is your automatic mind. The slow is where you're more consciously involved. So this is similar, but not exactly the same, but similar to the distinction of your unconscious or subconscious mind and your conscious mind. But that distinction itself is vague and ill-defined in a certain way and kind of misleading, right? With the system 1 and system 2, it doesn't really, it's kind of useful because it doesn't get involved with consciousness all that much. So in that way, like we can talk about consciousness in conjunction with this instead of getting tripped up by the kind of just the kind of vague and distinction of the subconscious and conscious mind. So he doesn't like do research on the difference between the subconscious mind and conscious mind. What he does do research on is the workings of like system 1 and system 2. So system 2 is where you're thinking slowly and intentionally, and it takes like effort to do, and your mind will tend to make you want to, or out of necessity even. It's like a limited resource, and you get kind of exhausted where you'll feel like thinking on purpose and carefully counting things up. Like if you again were to have to draw out a line that was as long, like the sum of all these lines, doing a task like that kind of taxes your mind, right? So using system 2 is like taxing on your effort or your mind or some kind of resource, right? And as it gets overtaxed, you have less ability to either pay attention to other things and or check over other things. You'll just be like it's more, you'll much more easily like jump at someone or just be kind of like you won't have that check on your emotions in the same way, or you won't notice false ideas in the same way, right? So the idea that it's a limited resource fits really well into our strategic paradigm of allocating limited resources. And then realizing how system one works. See, system one are kind of subconscious or automatic mind or a fast mind, whatever. But it's great to call it system one because then it bypasses the kind of vagueness and blurriness and kind of misleadingness of calling it subconscious or conscious. So I'm going to start more and more as I explain this, stop talking about like subconscious or whatever, unconscious mind. So your system one uses heuristics. And he helped remind me of the nuanced meaning of the word heuristic. So a heuristic is like a way of doing something, but it specifically, it's instead of doing something hard, you substitute a sort of easier way of doing something. Instead of doing it the hard way, you kind of do it, but kind of cut corners, right? So you do it kind of the easy way and kind of a corner cutting way. So your system one cuts corners in predictable ways that can be discovered. And it can be fascinating because when we talk about controlling our mind, and last webinar I talked about like Othello, and we want to, like, the real way to control your mind is, I'm thinking you're kind of flipping the script, like I talked about opposite day last webinar. It kind of starts with not having the same kind of confidence in your mind. Now that in a circular way will feel like negative progress. Like people feel like they do want to have confidence in their mind, and what are they going to do if they don't have confidence in their own mind? They're like, if I can't trust my own mind, what can I trust? Well, it actually turns out that you get the reward is like everything. If you stop trusting your system one mind, and also then you want to use your system two properly or the right way, because you don't want to trust that either if you're not using the right method. But when you stop trusting it, you don't need to trust it. You don't need to believe that a model is not a model. Believing that a model is totally productive. Like, back to the idea of a video game. If you're playing a game, you're a guy walking around with a sword and a shield and you're fighting goblins in a forest. It's perfectly productive to understand that it's a model, that there's a physics engine, that the goblin doesn't actually have bows and arrows or swords that are actually cutting you, right? It's like pixels that are representing it all, and there's a physics engine and there's a model that's going on. You can still use a model. You can use your system one better when you understand that it isn't about confidence with it. It isn't about believing the model is real. As a matter of fact, it's only freeing to understand that your whole concept of reality from top to bottom, until and unless you build some things in a separate way differently, is a model. Again, it's only freeing. You'll only have more control over your mind, more confidence built on a rock as we continue, and so forth, right? And I've alluded to this in different ways, but this is another angle on it. So no, you aren't lost or screwed if you don't have confidence in your mind. Instead, you can respect it for what it does. It's awesome at what it does. There's no reason why you need to believe that system one in your mind does something it doesn't. That's only unhelpful. You see? It would be like if you have a business partner and they're really good at something and they're really bad at something else, then it's not helpful to think that they're good at what they're bad at. You want to respect and understand what they're good at and harness that and find some way to compensate and have someone else do, perhaps, or whatever, what they're bad at, or have someone else help, or whatever it might be, right? Back to the opposite day idea of from last webinar. Remember, your mind thinks it's you in a certain way of thinking, and you think you're your mind. And you're each trying to do what the other's bad at, or what you're each trying to do what you're, sorry, I misspoke. You're each trying to do, it's all tangled, right? It's like backwards, so you have to kind of untangle it. But because you think you're the opposite person, you each think that you need to do what the other person's good at. But so you think you need to do what your mind's good at. Your mind thinks it needs to do what you're good at, and that's exactly the opposite. You don't need to have confidence in the backwards thing where each person is doing what they're bad at. You can untangle that and have confidence in each doing what they're good at, and you get a real confidence that way. Just read you some little bit of random stuff here. I'll give you, this is just from page 245, chapter 23. A few years after my collaboration with Amos, that's, the other person who won the Nobel Prize with him, and Amos passed away, unfortunately, began. A few years after my collaboration with Amos began, I convinced some officials in the Israeli Ministry of Education. They were originally in Israel. Then he taught at Princeton and did some work there. I believe he taught. He certainly did some work there in Princeton. Anyway, they convinced him of the need for a curriculum to teach judgment and decision making in high schools. The team that I assembled to design the curriculum and write a textbook for it included several experienced teachers, some of my psychology students, and Seymour Fox, the then dean of the Hebrew University School of Education. And he was an expert in curriculum development. Okay, so that's his team. Experienced teachers, psychology students, Seymour Fox, an expert in curriculum development. After meeting every Friday afternoon for about a year, we had constructed a detailed outline of the syllabus, had written a couple of chapters, and had run a few sample lessons in the classroom. We all felt that we had made good progress. By the way, how do I talk about progress? Psychological nearness and so forth, right? One day, as we were discussing procedures for estimating uncertain quantities, the idea, so they're talking about estimating things that are uncertain, right? Amounts that are uncertain. The idea of conducting an exercise occurred to me. I asked everyone to write down an estimate of how long it would take us to submit a finished draft of the textbook they were working on to the Ministry of Education. I was following a procedure that we had already planned to incorporate into our curriculum. So they were doing something right then with each other that they were planning to teach their students to do. The proper way to elicit information from a group, this is kind of a side point here. The proper way to elicit information from a group, but this will come up, and I use this when I deal with projects, and I kind of manage projects and design things and kind of run a business, so to speak. What I'm about to say, but this is kind of a side point, but it's still interesting. The proper way to elicit information from a group is not by starting with a public discussion, but by confidentially collecting each person's judgment individually. This procedure makes better use of the knowledge available to members of the group than the common practice of open discussion. Right, you get why that is, because when you have an open discussion, then people all start to try to agree with each other. And so whatever the first number is, they try to get closer to it. And so, you're not getting each person's, kind of unbiased in that way. When you ask people individually, they'll have their other biases, but at least you're avoiding the kind of group collectivism kind of bias. Anyway, so again, this is a side point that we don't have to get too wrapped up in that. Okay, I collected the estimates and jotted the results on the blackboard. They were narrowly centered around 2 years. So again, the estimate for how long it would take them to finish this project or this curriculum, this textbook, these people estimated at 2 years. The low end was 1.5 years. The high end was 2.5 years. So they were all very close to each other at about 2 years. Then I had another idea. I turned to Seymour, our curriculum expert, and asked whether he could think of other teams similar to ours that had developed a curriculum from scratch. You ready for this? This was a time when several pedagogical innovations like new math had been introduced. And Seymour said he could think of quite a few, right? Again, quite a few different teams of people in different subjects that had assembled to do a similar thing. What they're doing, make a textbook, basically a curriculum for a topic. I then asked whether he knew the history of these teams in some detail, and it turns out he was familiar with several. I asked him to think of these teams when they had made as much progress as we had. So they'd been working for about a year, right, at this point. How long from that point, so from the year they've already done, how long from that point did it take them to finish their textbook projects? So we're now asking a pretty common sense question, right? What's the base rate out there in the world of how long it normally takes people to to finish projects. When we look at it, once we see that question, that seems like, well, we should have asked that to begin with. But these people actually came up with numbers, including Seymour himself, the expert, came up with a number ignoring what we're about to say, which is going to be fascinating. He fell silent, Seymour did, when we asked him this question of how long does it take other people when they're in the similar position as us. When he finally spoke, it seemed to me that he was blushing, embarrassed by his own answer. I never realized this before, Seymour said, but in fact, not all the teams at a stage comparable to ours ever did complete their task. A substantial fraction of the teams ended up failing to finish the job. None of the people said they might fail, right? They all said between 1.5 and 2.5 years. This was worrisome. We had never considered the possibility that we might fail. My anxiety rising, I asked how large he estimated that fraction to be. About 40%, he answered. By now, a pall of gloom was falling over the room, right? Didn't I talk about this mental image of people on a project? And they're discussing, and Daniel here is discussing this gloom that they felt, which is the worst. Imagine being in a paradigm like this, which everyone is. These people aren't anyone else, right? They're just very normal, even though it's their field, right? And again, Kahneman has a ton of awesome stuff. Like this book is just nonstop awesomeness. Okay, so him admitting this or showing this, don't let it make you disrespect him or anything. But think about how they felt this gloom, right? So they were confronting reality. They were thinking accurately, more accurately now, and they felt like they were making negative progress, right? Like they felt gloom. Isn't that fascinating? They're in a paradigm like everyone else, where accurate thinking makes them feel bad, makes their mind feel like they're going backward. Can you imagine that? We probably can, because we've all lived in this paradigm, right? It's all around us. But if we step outside of that, isn't it shocking that? And this isn't even his exact point, although it's close. But the gloom isn't his point. The gloom is my point here. Is one of the points. But his point's fascinating too. The next question was obvious. Those who finished, how long did it take them? Seymour, the expert, said, I cannot think of any group that finished in less than 7 years, he replied, nor any that took more than 10, 7 to 10 years. And yet he himself said about 2 years. And there's many reasons for this. One of them is that when people have a specific instance in front of them, they'll like only look at that instance, and they basically will completely ignore base rates. And Seymour himself knew this information, right? He said it a few minutes later. At least he knew it once he was asked, but his mind did not think it through. Remember I said that it is far less great at adding things up and thinking things through. We assume our mind takes into account obvious known facts and relates them. It does not do that. And when people, just like when someone's confronted with a specific person, people do this with politicians. A lot of people will say they'll vote for the person. They'll be swayed by the candidate and what they say and do, or what they say in a debate and what they claim they're going to do, which to me, it fascinates me how someone could be that ridiculous as to vote for a candidate. You vote for basically who their constituents are, what the vectors are in the candidate, not what they say about themselves or how they seem to present themselves. It's like hiring someone based on a job interview. That's madness. It's been shown to be utter madness. There's no correlation between how somebody appears in a job interview and how they are, just none. But it feels like there's so much it feels like when you meet them in person, you look them in the eye, you talk to them, it feels to your mind like there's so much information there that it will ignore base rates and statistics. There was relating to all this, there was a sports agent, I believe it was an agent, not a manager of a team, but whatever, it might be a manager actually. But one way or the other, he yeah, it might have been a manager. He went by statistics. Every other scout and stuff would meet the ball players and get a sense of them and use that as part of how they pick people in draft. And this one guy was just, no, I'm just going to go straight by the statistics. And that is absolutely correct. That's what you want to do. Because there's basically it feels to your mind like there's a ton of information when you like meet somebody, or there's the kind of this specific information. In this case, the working on the project for a year, knowing the team members, knowing the curriculum, it felt like so relevant information. So as we continue with the story, what do you think it was? So their minds completely 100% felt like all that specific information of the incidents at hand, that was overwhelmingly relevant. It turns out that it was 100% irrelevant, and that all that mattered was the base rates. I'll continue reading. So the last thing I read was how the expert Seymour said, I can't, of the people that finished, right, the 6% that finished, it was between 7 and 10 years. And so then I'm reading now from first person from Daniel Kahneman. Daniel says, I grasped at a straw. When you compare our skills and resources to those of the other groups, how good are we? How would you rank us in comparison with those teams? Seymour did not hesitate long this time. We're below average but not by much, compared to the skill of the other teams' main curriculum. This came as a complete surprise to all of us, including Seymour, whose prior estimate had been well within the optimistic consensus of the group. Until I prompted him, there was no connection in his mind between his knowledge of the history of other teams and his forecast of our future. Now, I'll talk for a second again. This book has like 10 or more of these major kind of heuristics of our mind that are places where you're going to feel so confident and so right and be totally ridiculous in your thinking. And one thing we can try and do is learn these things, right? But then there's another kind of deeper perspective where we see, once we're outside of this whole paradigm I've been describing to you on this webinar and previously, I'm constantly alluding to it, where there's this whole idea relates to struggle and confidence and trusting your mind and wanting to feel awesome, and norms and standards and perspective, like thinking with perspectives versus not, all this stuff, right? Wanting to prove you're already right without realizing it, right? Wanting to prove you're already awesome and good and deserving. When we're outside of that paradigm, we make the big switch, then separate from trying to memorize like all these things, it's kind of feels, it's more natural to, like, it's easier to remember them and apply them with the switch, but also it's easier not to fall into the trap. But you don't want to feel like, oh, I made a paradigm switch, so I'll just, my system one will get everything right. Your system one will always work as system one does. You know, it might have certain things kind of memorized and such that it gets things more right, but it's much more about, it's again, the Othello thing. What it will do is have boundaries that it'll work within. And so the wiggle room for its heuristics or its models to screw you up, they'll be within boundaries, foundations, frames, understandings that like the area that it's messing up in or guessing in. It's not really messing up. It has to guess within. There's limits to your knowledge, but the limits are more like day-to-day detail type stuff rather than meta fundamental understandings of life. But people, once again, it's like opposite day. People feel like it's futile to think about deep, pervasive, critical, foundational ideas about God, who they are, how the mind works, who the mind is versus themselves, things like that, right? About confidence and strategy and bottlenecks. Sorry, I lost my moment train of thought there. So it's within the details. It's not within. So it's outside of the law of implication paradigm and the kind of the normal messed up way of thinking when people think that they're their mind and their mind thinks that they're them, et cetera, et cetera. That's all blurred together. People don't want to think about deep ideas. They feel like it's futile, and it is for them because there's certain breakthroughs like that they don't have that kind of makes it impossible for them. to get things fundamentally right about knowing God exists and who they are and all that stuff. But it turns out that what you can really know is stuff like that, especially. And then you have to make educated guess within kind of a lot of the day-to-day detailed stuff. Like exactly how much money you have to make, per month or best to make or whatever, or shoot for, right? That you can't necessarily figure that out exactly. Or that, I don't know if that's the best example, but just for example. Or you can have certain things that are important in a relationship and are important in a person. That you can know, but to know whether a particular person is the ideal person for you to date or try to date or marry or anything in between is more of an educated guess, right? It's more of a guess within boundaries that you can't know the exact. So again, the nature of the stuff you can know tends to be flipped. And so what we can know is awesome because it boundaries in and narrows down where our system one is guessing. And then if we understand the nature of how system one does its guesses, then furthermore, when necessary, or often when we can step in when it's predictably going to kind of make certain mistakes, or we can spot things, and so on and so forth. Oh, well, just like Daniel did here. I mean, he did in fact ask these questions instead of just not think to ask them, right? Okay, he continues. Daniel says, the author says, our state of mind when we heard Seymour is not well described by stating what we quote unquote knew. Surely all of us quote unquote knew that a minimum of 7 years and 40% chance of failure was a more plausible forecast of the fate of our project than the numbers we had written on our slips of paper a few minutes earlier, right? Like 2 years is what they'd written. But we did not acknowledge what we knew. The new forecast still seemed unreal. You see this block where people can even think accurately, but it's blocked by their norms and standards and their system one functioning. You see, the system one is like an elephant and they're a little rider that's getting controlled by the elephant, and they can kind of, right? Like in the normal paradigm, people can operate their free will within a small area, and the outer frames are controlled by system one. That's what happened to them here. We can reverse that, where our system one, our guessing, is operating in a small area. And so we're not controlling our mind within small details and so forth necessarily. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not, whatever. But we are controlling the frames, the outside frames, the Othello board and so forth. But they were not, right? These people here did not, because they did not acknowledge what they knew. The new forecast still seemed unreal because we could not imagine how it could take so long to finish a project that looked so manageable. No crystal ball was available to tell us the strange sequence of unlikely events that were in our future. All we could see was a reasonable plan. Remember I talked about plan A? That should produce a book in about 2 years, conflicting with statistics indicating that other teams had failed. And this isn't even average statistics. Remember, the expert said he couldn't think of one that took less than 7 years. It wasn't like the average was 7 years or 8 or 8.5 years, right? It was not one was less than 7. And they still believed they would take 2. Isn't that fascinating? I'm not criticizing them. Instead, I'm using them as a reflection of normalcy, right? Of ourselves, until and unless we truly break through and break out, and beware of wanting to believe that we're smarter and more awesome if we make this paradigm shift sooner rather than later that I'm talking about. Right? Our mind will keep on going back to, oh, I want to believe I'm smart and awesome, and yeah, I've made the shift. Yeah, I do things this way. You want to have a real breakthrough, not fall for false breakthroughs. And you do that by not worrying about whether you've made the paradigm shift. Just keep trying to understand it better and better. And then either you'll make it big time and you'll know it all of a sudden, or you'll make it gradually and you'll keep spotting things you haven't made, and in places you'll get things right and you'll get things wrong. The things you get right will help you greatly in life, and you'll snowball benefit from that part. And then you'll spot things that you're getting wrong because you're not convincing yourself you've already made all the breakthrough, and because you're so awesome and smart, right? What we had heard was base rate information from which we should have inferred a causal story. If so many teams failed, and if those that succeeded took so long, Running a curriculum was surely much harder than we had thought. But such an inference would have conflicted with our direct experience of the good progress we had been making. The statistics that Seymour provided were treated as base rates normally are, noted and promptly set aside. We should have quit that day. Now he tells what actually happened in history, the fate of the project, because this was many years ago, decades ago. None of us was willing to invest 6 more years of work in a project with a 40% chance of failure. And yet they were going to have to, right? Although we must have sensed that, and this is exactly the sort of thing that's going to come up in business and or your, it could be a job or business constantly with projects. But although we must have sensed that persevering was not reasonable, the warning did not provide an immediately compelling reason to quit. After a few minutes of desultory, that means like not much debate, not taken seriously debate, we gathered ourselves together and carried on as if nothing had happened. The book was eventually completed 8 years later. By that time, I was no longer living in Israel and had long since ceased to be part of the team, which completed the task after many unpredictable vicissitudes. Now, what could have been predicted was not the exact things that would, quote unquote, go wrong, but instead that it would take a certain amount of time, which means that things would come up, right? And I do that in business where it isn't that I say this exact thing will happen, but I catch so many issues like this. The initial enthusiasm for the idea in the Ministry of Education had waned by the time the text was delivered and it was never used. This embarrassing episode remains one of the most instructive experiences of my professional life. I eventually learned 3 lessons from it. The first was immediately apparent. I had stumbled onto a distinction between 2 profoundly different approaches to forecasting, which Amos and I later labeled the inside view and the outside view. The second lesson was that, see, there's a humility and a curiosity that Daniel Kahneman has, and a brilliance, right? That are real and that are very laudable, and presumably why he's discovered so many awesome things. The second lesson was that our initial forecast of about 2 years for the completion of the projects exhibited a planning fallacy. Our estimates were closer to a best case scenario than to a realistic assessment. And remember, that best case scenario was 5 years shy of the literal best case scenario that had ever existed. So it wasn't even best case if you think about it. Best case would have been 7 years, if that makes sense. Not that you can't have, can't beat the 7 years in at all, but you get my point. I was slower to accept the third lesson, which I call irrational perseverance. I talk about perseverance is not the key to success. It might be the bottleneck. Perseverance, having the right momentum, whatever. If it's the bottleneck, it's the key to the bottleneck, right? Like the bottleneck needs to be whatever the most impactful or whatever all the real bottlenecks are towards reaching a goal, which in and of itself, right, is another bottleneck, break another bottleneck. But whatever, if perseverance is the only thing lacking, then it's the key, right? But it's the other thing perseverance can do is do the opposite. I call irrational perseverance. The folly we displayed that day in failing to abandon the project. And again, they should have abandoned it. Why? Because none of them actually were willing to spend 6 years doing it. So that's why, if they were, then they shouldn't abandon it, right? They shouldn't abandon it merely because it would be 7 years, but just because they weren't willing. And so if you think about it, their number of 2 years was really based on a heuristic. There's a good example of a heuristic. He doesn't even explain this part. But heuristic is when, again, your mind cuts corners and substitutes one, in this case, like a question for another. And so what question were they really answering when the answer was about 2 years? It was, how long am I willing to spend on this project, or after which amount, for how much time do I deserve? Remember, I rant against this idea of when you deserve to get a result, right? After how much time do I, as a member of the project, or we overall, deserve to get our reward, to finish the textbook and get it implemented and stuff, right? They're asking like, how much am I willing? How much should I put in? At what point do I deserve to get my reward? Not how long would it realistically take. Unless you both make a paradigm shift and basically, understand this, you will make this fallacy constantly. Like this will come up with you with, the deserving, in addition to what he's saying, where you'll feel like you deserve to have learned something, a certain thing you're trying to master by now, or gotten a client by now by this many phone calls, or, ranked a site or whatever it might be, right? And so your mind is going to, again, substitute its idea of when you deserve a reward for how many resources it feels like you should allocate. Is that strategic? Allocating resources by this standard that your mind comes up with of when you deserve your reward? If you put in this many resources, that's when you deserve to get a result? No, right? You obviously want to allocate resources on a cost benefit basis and be thinking and doing things that are going to increase your understanding and therefore your accuracy of estimating. At some point you're guessing, probably in most cases, of the amount of resources you need to put into something, right? But you guess, but then you put in resources until you're finished. Okay, so that gives you a taste of the book, and I'll delve into it some more next time and continue with this next time. Bryce says, David, I can't tell you how many companies have rejected me because of my interviewing performance, which I believe is supposedly good. From the end, they told me it wasn't, or oftentimes they would ignore, or they would just reject me flat out. It's just so annoying how many companies. Oh, wow. Have you, if that's the case, then, right, you would want to, that's great that you've heard that it wasn't, and then you want to, one way or the other, find out how to act, right? Like learn from books and or people how to act in interviews, and don't think that like you should like be yourself or something like that, right? The same thing I talk about that on dates. This idea that you should be yourself. You might need to. The whole idea of being fake is a nonsense idea, right? If you're having a performance for an audience to get a result, then you want to figure out how to perform in the way that works for the audience. That's not fake. It's the audience, right? You're performing for an audience. If you're on a date, if you're in a job interview, if you're doing a webinar, right? Not this idea of being yourself, right? Your standards don't matter. And that's why I talk about morality, so you can have stop with all the BS morality, right? If you're violating a contract, someone's property rights in various ways, that's immoral. Nothing else is, essentially. Separately, we can care about people, but incredibly powerful. I filled up notebook page is great. It starts by not having confidence in your own mind. Grainbreaker, excellent. Yeah, Mike is really excited about this book after I showed it to him a couple weeks ago, or I reminded him of it a couple weeks ago, and I kind of framed it for him. He's getting a ton out of it. How does our mind occlude us from seeing certain things? For example, if someone shares something that's true, well, it's just this. I mean, all we can do is observe that when someone feels like something's normal, they feel, and they don't know, they don't have a paradigm where they have a method for knowing what's true. They just have these feelings of what's true or not. And so the method of knowing what's true just comes up with a feeling for them, right? Like we want to get to where we have a method of knowing what's true that we need to have an open space for a method that can come up with things that are correct, like the way we do math, like simple math. And people don't have that space for the idea of something actually being true. Their idea of truth is different than that. And then they go by a feeling, and the feeling from norms is just stronger than just some statement there, basically. Good, good. I'm glad you're definitely go through this series, Bryce, the definitive series. I think it's a great series. Great. Okay. Excellent stuff. I will end the webinar here. Appreciate you guys, and I will be back next next webinar, which uh, check back in 2 weeks in the group, and then I'll post. I'll either tell you it's going to be in a week or so, or I will give the link. You're very welcome, John, and Dave, and Kim. Take care, everyone. That's a mind explosion about estimating and how asking those questions lead to accurate thinking. The mind doesn't refer to, yeah, it's an amazing story, right? There's a ton of that in this book. I think it's worth reading multiple times. And again, it really goes along with LOI very well. I really like people to do the science for me. I'm not really a scientist in the sense that I want to run a bunch of experiments. I'm more of a kind of a theoretician, theory crafter, and so forth. So I work really well, so to speak. I don't mean I work with him personally, but I work really well with someone else doing the science, just the way Greg does the science, with my business. Based on my mind, standards and norms, I'd say that was a great webinar. I love it. I knew I was going to get some of that. I've been reading the book too slowly. Yeah, just got an audio book of the book. Excellent, wonderful. Okay, guys, wonderful. I've been tuning in. Oh, did Mike must have told you about it, huh? Mike's been telling everyone. All right, I will talk to you all soon. See you soon, and thanks for all your feedback.